Today on Roll for Insight, I'm sitting down with Elephant Bear, a DM and animation extraordinaire. We talk about Dungeons and Dragons horror stories, sci-fi D&D, the stresses of DMing, as well as Adventurers League. All that today on Roll for Insight. So, we'll ask this again. We've already been talking before this, of course. But I'll ask again for the audience, how are you doing today?
I'm fine, thank you, Chris.
Of course. So,
And yourself?
I'm doing very, very well. So, you currently have a YouTube channel where you talk about Dungeons and Dragons, specifically your campaign. And I was curious, you have a sci fi campaign specifically. When you compare running sci fi to running fantasy, like what do you see as the comparison? Which one do you prefer?
If it's a tricky question, I would prefer running sci-fi, purely because I'll be honest, I'm more of that kind of nerd. But in my head, there's so many more tropes about fantasy Dungeons and Dragons. Oh, you walk into a kobold dungeon. Oh, my players automatically know everything that's going to happen in that dungeon because they know what kobolds are, they know what the dungeons are like, they know the traps. Whereas if they're in space and you come across an alien spaceship of a species you've never met before, now suddenly we're in a murky waters because they don't know what's coming.
So when you're developing these alien races, because I was recently listening to a lecture about making fantasy and alien races, it's something that takes a lot of writing to make them not only realistic and believable, but also fun. It's a balance. So, which one do you see as the driving force? Do you prefer making them just fun, or do you try to strive for that sort of believability in their society?
Well, so far, luckily enough, my players haven't spent egregious amounts of time with any one particular race that I've had to then quickly back up and flesh up. Um, so it's, I would say I prefer leaning towards the fun side of that spectrum. But a lot of the races that I say a lot, most of the races I use are from the Mage Hand Press Dark Matter book. In my game, they've met, say, 50-50, but a lot of the races I've introduced have been low tech worlds where they visited.
When you're developing these worlds, do you prefer that kind of low tech atmosphere? Or do you prefer an alien race who's introduced a lot of new, interesting laser guns?
uh, I do prefer an interesting race that's got a lot of laser guns. Um, the low tech worlds, though, are easy to just throw in because like in Star Trek episodes, it's just a one and done. They're very unlikely to be revisiting these worlds, so you can just do crazy things with it.
So when you're world building, it's secondary to the primary adventure that you're crafting at the time.
Yes,
Yeah.
mainly. I don't like to prepare too far ahead of my players because I feel that way is down the railroad path.
Oh yeah.
So I personally am only about one or maybe two sessions ahead of where they are, depending on how much um, I don't want to say dither, how much they explore in the one location. So I don't like to say, all right, okay, and they're going to get to here, then this person's going to send them there, and then this person's going to send them there, because then that's also a case of they don't get to play their way. I read, I think it was Sly Flourish tip. I don't know if you follow them on Twitter. It was as a dungeon master, your job isn't to write the story; it's to write the skeleton of the story, and then let your players write it.
Yeah. I was watching a Ginny D video on bad DM traits. I saw that one of the tips that she recommended is that DMs let go of that feeling of control because
Mm.
in the end, I mean, the narrative should belong to the players. And the ultimate form of letting go of control is allowing your game to be that open world
Mm.
experience. And it seems that you let your players go to a lot of different places. How do you balance that with the preparation of DMing? Like if they go somewhere out of the way, somewhere you didn't expect, how do you manage to give a compelling adventure on the
That
fly?
was one of the reasons I wanted them to be part of an organization like the United Coalition of Planets in my universe, or Star Trek, if you're not familiar with my work. Um, just because that gives them initially more direction rather than just being, all right, you're four people on a space station. You're approached by a mysterious figure. What do you do? Now they've got missions coming in. They've got an organization structure. They've got which also again immediate world building.
Yeah, world building is a big part of fantasy, big part of
Mm.
sci-fi. And when you're creating those organizations for your players to be a part of, a lot of people will resist being part of an organization. Like, for example, I've allowed or tried to allow my players to join up with various factions, and they almost always say no. Do you find that your players resist trying to follow the United Coalition of Planets and their directive, or are they happy to just go along with what they're trying to do?
Mix of both. I have a few of my players are quite happy to be part of the Coalition of Planets, and one of my players, in particular, Casil, the simian race, is definitely dragging his heels on being part of the United Coalition of Planets. It's one of those. This is where the story's going. Now, I don't want to railroad you, but all your friends and family in game are telling you your character, maybe you should give this a look. Maybe you should do this.
So, yeah, when you're trying to get a player to do something, how do you incentivize that? Is it reward? Do you talk to them outside the game?
I'm always asking my players for feedback at the end of every session, and most of the time it's just, no, it was fun, it was fine. I don't know what you want me to do with you. As a character because I'm a very player driven DM. So I like to have my characters' backstories and weave my story around that rather than have my back and my story and then weave my characters around that. So I feel that way the players are more invested in what's going on if it's directly tied to their characters. Um, so with getting it's again it's a fine line between railroading and incentivizing your players to do what you want. um, I have loved ones who are quite often in peril. I have rewards dangled tantalizingly ahead for players who like achievements and advancements.
This
It's
okay.
really about knowing your players and knowing what drives them more than the characters sometimes.
Before we end off the D&D talking points part, when you're
Mm-hmm.
playing D&D, do you have any practical advice for other DM stuff about like preparation, in-game stuff, just practical things for DM to incorporate into their games?
This comes back to what kind of game you play, module or homebrew. With module, absolutely do more than read the module 5 minutes before the start of the session. Because I've played with DMs like that, and it was through no fault of their own. They were just they had like 4 or 5 other games that week to run, and they just didn't have the time. But it showed.
Right.
Um, so don't try and overtax yourself as a DM. Know what your capabilities are, um, and make sure you read the module. Um, whereas with homebrew, don't overthink it.
Right.
It's it's especially with homebrew over module is where the players take it rather than where the story goes.
So when you're homebrewing stuff, you recommend people don't kind of like overextend themselves, like keep it grounded
It
in the sessions you're running.
Yeah, it's coming back to again Lord of the Rings. Don't write the Silmarillion before you have the hobbits leaving the Shire.
Right, absolutely. So, we've kind of touched on a couple things that good DMs do and some things
Hmm.
that bad DMs do. So, obviously, both of us have looked at RPG horror stories. So,
Hmm.
when you're looking at bad DM traits, traits on RPG horror stories, other than the ones that are just like bad people traits, like being
Yeah,
racist or something,
that's a lot of it, though. I'll be
oh
honest on
yeah,
RPG horror stories.
some of them get crazy bad. When you're looking at D&D traits specifically, what do you think is the worst?
For DMs or for players?
Ooh, DMs first.
DMs first. Like I said, ill prepared. Um, because again, I don't want to mention any names, but he was running Dungeon of the Mad Mage. So yeah, so we were like, oh, we go into the next room. What happens? He's like, okay, give me a minute. He had his fingers in like 5 pages, and he was just flicking backwards and forwards between all of them. Which Dungeons of the Mad Mage is, if you don't know, is a big mega dungeon, and it's not. There's so much information there. There's not the sort of thing you can just pick up 5 minutes before the session and be ready.
What about for players? What do you think is the worst trait that players embody in their game?
I don't want to say lack of appreciation, but your DM, if they've probably been watching the videos, reading the tutorials, they've probably put a lot of work into the game, and it's one thing to say, "Oh, that was fun, I enjoyed that," but it's another to have them be at the table and then like not really be at the table mentally, like they've checked out, and like so it goes round, and then 30 minutes later you're like, oh, I should include them in some way to bring them back into it, and they go, oh, what's going on, I'm sorry, I haven't been
Oh,
following. You want, as a DM, you want your players to make these connections themselves, to take stuff away from your world, and when they go, oh, I'm sorry, what's happening, and then you have to just bullet point it back to them, you're kind of like then at that point feeding them breadcrumbs, like, oh, I want you to know this,
yeah, like
because
one
you're just
thing.
telling them the important bits.
Yeah, because one thing I was always uncomfortable with is like telling my players, here's your options. Like because they don't have any
Yeah.
idea. Like, oh, you could do this or you could do this. And I have the self awareness to be aware that that's not railroading, but it's like getting there, right? Like you're telling
Yeah.
your players straight up, hey, this is what you should be doing.
The other way that works is when my players go, "Oh, well, I guess we have to do this," and I'm sitting there going, "Well, I want them to do that, but I don't want to feel that they have to do it." So then I give them other options, like, "Well, you could do it this way, you could do it that way." And
Yeah, like I just gave my players five legendary weapons to chase, and
mm,
one of them is in the possession of an uber powerful blue dragon. That one they're going after last. They
hmm,
could go after it first if they wanted to. Could have a heist adventure where they steal it off his finger, like
mm,
Not Frodo, but Bilbo going in to get the Arkenstone. I think this only happened in the movie, but doing that for the dragon in my campaign instead. But they chose, hey, let's go after the four other weapons first, and then we fight the dragon, like all out fight, no heist, which I I like.
yeah,
But
that's always the player mentality as well. Is if we do the hardest one last, not only will we have the better equipment at that point, we'll also have leveled up and have better experience and better abilities to use against it. I do prefer a bit of hamstringing, though. I do prefer making my players think on their feet with what they have, because Dungeons and Dragons isn't just a multiple choice test. It
oh
really
yeah.
is. You can do anything.
So when you're trying to offer those players those options, I mean, you're really trying to avoid those railroading stories.
Mm.
Yeah, because those suck. Especially if you both play the game and DM, because you're just painfully aware of how bad it could be.
Yeah, my one of my first homebrew campaigns I tried to do was uh, a sneaky time travel. So they were just being teleported about, and they were meant to then piece together that they were being teleported through time as well as through space. But it was a difficult thing to get away with without it just being railroad, because you're like, oh, now I'm taking you and I'm putting you here. Oh, now I'm taking you again and I'm putting you here.
Right.
And there was no chance for them to do their own thing,
Have
as
you
it
ever
were.
played in a railroaded campaign?
It's I would argue that any like Adventurers League or any module is a bit of a railroaded campaign, especially some of the more early 5e books, which I have played some of. But I wouldn't say any of my friends' homebrews have been. My DM time versus player time is 50-50, because it's just me and my friend who take turns. So he takes Monday nights, I take Thursday nights, and then Friday's Adventurers League. So it's a toss up.
So when you're playing Adventures League games, I've heard things about Adventures League. Could you like pitch it to me? Give me the pitch. What is Adventures League?
Adventurers League is the official uh, Dungeons and Dragons nights. The rules are a bit more concrete. Obviously, homebrew, there's always a chance the DM can go, you know what? No, that was a fantastic line. Your fireball spell does 10d6 now rather than 8d6. Whereas with Adventurers League, it's much more right. These are the rules as written. You have to obey them. Um, but it's also a fantastic way if you want to get to learn Dungeons and Dragons and you don't have happen to have six friends who also want to get to learn Dungeons and Dragons. You can just go along by yourself or with one or two of your friends and learn the system, basically, because there's always a spare dungeon master. I won't say always, that's a bit of an overreach, but there's a dungeon master there willing to teach. Um, at the moment, because obviously the pandemic, everything's moved to online. We use Roll20, the program, um, which again wasn't the easiest for a lot of people to pick up. But Dungeons and Dragons survives.
Yeah, of course. So
Um,
have you ever had a bad experience at Adventures League, whether it be a DM running or a player who joined in? Because, I mean, it's kind of hard to refuse someone when they get there.
I've had that's the issue with RPG horror stories. You hear RPG horror stories, and they're mainly about Adventurers League because you're playing with strangers, and it starts to paint the picture that that's all Adventurers League is, and it's just such a small percentage.
Mm.
But because obviously those are the funniest story, well, sometimes they're not funny, but those are the most interesting stories. Those are the ones that keep getting retold. Um, Rather than oh, we played through water deep dragon heist and it was amazing.
So when you're reading RPG horror stories, have you noticed that those kind of negative things really stick out? I mean, when you look on YouTube, the most popular D&D narrations are often the bad ones, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's I mean, it's not something you take personally because you know what your strengths are and your weaknesses are as a DM, and like we mentioned earlier, a lot of it isn't even about the people's D&D abilities. It's just about them as a person and favoritism or sexism or racism
Yeah.
or something. Um, so it's one of those. I know I wouldn't stand for that in any of my games. It's with my homebrew stuff. I do a session zero, and I highly recommend session zeros to anyone. Um,
So, to
so I
get
take
back,
it from your response there that you don't play Adventurers League.
I haven't. I've tried, but there's not a place around in my area where I
Mm.
can just easily pop in to Adventures League. I actually haven't played D&D in 3 years, so it's been kind of hard finding games. I used to play with my WoW guild, but we fell out. And by the way, can we both agree the real RPG horror story is getting like 4 to 5 people around your table at the same time? It can be really difficult.
This, me, my friends and I, the way we've coped is we just have days of the week. It's like Monday Dungeons and Dragons, Thursday Dungeons and Dragons. That's it. If you can't, it's not a case of asking you if you can make it. It's a case of you telling us if you can't.
When you're scheduling, do you have like a scheduling? This isn't like to shag anyone, like things happen,
Mm.
but do you have like a scheduling pet peeve? For me, it's just saying, like, I am busy for 2 hours. Like, 2 hours from when to when? Like, that's mine.
My pet peeve it would be 15 minutes after you're meant to start getting the message, gonna be late.
Oh, you're already late.
How late?
Come
What
on.
are you talking about?
Are you
We
being
already know
food?
you're going to be late because you are late.
Yeah, right now. Do you have any just general D&D pet peeves? Not necessarily RPG horror stories levels.
Not knowing your own character
Oh yeah.
would be one of my pet peeves because I've seen games just making good speed and then suddenly they'd come to a standstill because someone's like, oh, no, I know I had this ability, or did it? Was it a spell, or was it a something? Let me just look in the rule book. Let me just look in this character sheet. Okay,
Absolutely.
it wouldn't be too bad, but you're a fighter. Come on.
I was going to say not being able to keep track of your health and your AC. Like, oh,
Mm.
where was I again? Am I down?
Hmm. As a DM, I like to keep track of all my players' ACs, armor class, um, just because, again, I feel it breaks flow if I say, "Oh, I rolled an 18." Does that? It's much smoother a game if I say, "Oh, and he hits you," or "Oh, and he just wings wide."
So when you're running, you tend to have the characters in your party, right
Mm.
there in front of you, so you
Yeah,
just reference.
yeah. I have. I like to have a cheat sheet almost on the back of my DM screen with characters starting HP because don't try and keep track of their HP the entire game. That's the way madness lies. The dexterity modifiers for saving throws and the like. Only if I'm know specifically, oh, they've got a dragon fight coming up. Say, Dragon's Breath is a dex saving throw. Keep a track of everyone's dex saves to know who's going to be in the most trouble. Um, I won't say I avoid people I know are going to be put in immediate danger because I like threat. I like the threat of the game, but I will say I do try and keep it fair.
Right.
Like I
So
don't
before, oh,
pummel someone who's already down.
do you have any like last advice for DMs, players? Doesn't matter.
Know your character, know your world, because then no matter what happens, no matter what situation arises, you should know what your person will do at any one time. If your players go, oh, I walk into a blacksmithy, you don't need to have planned out the entire map of the city and know where what everything is, but you should have a few names written down just to be on the safe side, and you should know, okay, this is going to be a dwarf. Let's give my dwarf an interesting characteristic and just leave it at that.
So do you have any projects you like to announce before we wrap it up?
I've got a couple of new play. I was going to say playlists. That's not the right word. I've got a couple of new series I'm going to be trialing out. But obviously, since it's animation, trialing out means coming eventually.
Yeah. So, just side note, definitely subscribe to this guy. He puts way more effort into his videos than I have in the past like 3 months. Thank you so much for coming on and speaking to me
Thanks
today.
for having me. If you could take out all of my ums and ahs so I sound articulate, that I'd appreciate it.
I will try my best. But
Mm.
yeah, uh, today, thank you for coming. If you guys enjoyed today's episode of Roll for Insight, then please do leave a like. If you survived this entire video on YouTube, guess what? You didn't have to, because it's also going to be on Spotify, so you can check it out there instead and listen to this again in a more data friendly manner. Subscribe to Crispy Tavern on YouTube. Follow on whatever podcast platform you're on. Comment down below if you can. And until next time, farewell.